All right. Well, at this point, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I would like to show you guys some real history from Simple History. Life under the most evil communist regime, Khmer Rouge. Now, I haven't watched this. This is going to be my first interaction with this material. And I'm going to let it run for a little bit, especially the intro without pausing because I have to pee. So you won't be able to pause it. But as soon as I come back, we'll be able to discuss our thoughts on this, especially because I feel like this will be a good rudder to steer this conversation to the Blowback podcast and its latest series.
Sure.
All right, let's start.
Life under the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, famine, and S-21, 1975 to 1979. When the Vietnamese army captured Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, from the Khmer Rouge in 1979, they found the city in a terrible state. And among the horrors they came across was a former high school that had been turned into a prison and was known as Security Prison 21, or just S-21. The dark buildings were enclosed in electrified barbed wire, and iron bars covered all the windows. The prisoners included academics, doctors, monks, students, and their teachers, as well as factory workers and engineers. All were accused of being enemies of the regime and tortured and forced to name their friends and family members as co-conspirators. Whole families were often brought in together to be interrogated and executed. Ultimately, paranoia meant that the regime began to turn on itself, and the cells were soon filled with party activists and their families, and even high-ranking politicians. At least 18,145 people had been imprisoned there, and all but a handful had been executed. S-21 was only one of more than 150 torture and execution centers established by the Khmer Rouge. Today, it stands as a memorial to the lives lost and to the brutality that they inflicted upon the people of Cambodia.
I don't know, man. I'm not
The Khmer Rouge was the name given to the members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea.
Okay, it seems like you guys had a lot of thoughts on the animation style.
Well, now I'm looking at the food and the wine because they have champagne apparently too.
I hate to say it because Ben has done great work for us, Ben Clarkson, but I think we may have a candidate for next season's trailer, whoever made this. This is a little bit of a cut above, I would say, what we've done with that video.
I agree.
Okay,
I hate to say it.
So you're saying so far so good, no notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, look, I mean, it's not saying we were kind of talking over it, but it doesn't seem to be saying anything radically inaccurate.
Yeah, it's as Brendan pointed out, in fact, uses like a storytelling element that like we do, which is like, describing the scene, like the moment when like Vietnamese soldiers came into like the torture center of the Khmer Rouge, a place called S-21 or Tuol Sleng, in the capital city of Phnom Penh in Cambodia, after the Vietnamese kicked out the Khmer Rouge. And it's true, everything that they show in this video is all there. It just looks a little, it's
Is this what YouTube history? Is this what YouTube history is, or history YouTube? Like,
is this what we're up against, Hasan? Is this like our competitor?
I don't know. I've actually never even encountered this channel. I don't think. It's just I kind of looked at it and I was like, what's a good like short and sweet video that we can use as like.
I mean, I am it's like I said, the facts aren't bad.
A lot of people in the chat are saying yes, unironically yes, sadly yes.
that this is what YouTube history is like, because like sometimes I'll look for archival clips. YouTube, you'd be surprised how much you can find, of debates or Nixon or Kissinger tapes, and it's just easy to get from there. But I'll have to scroll by a lot of stuff, and it's the thumbnail of like of a white guy being like this, like looking shocked, and then he's got like a like a pastel background, and it says like, worst war crimes of all time ? And it doesn't.
Me off.
I was about to say, if anyone knows the Rob Wiseman tweet, Uber driver sucked me off. It kind of just has a very jarring thumbnailification of like quite heavy events. But I guess you could say the same thing about some episodes of our show. So I should probably just be humble.
Well, that's why we were saying that we should have this guy start doing our animation from now on.
In terms of like the content, I was peeing, so I didn't hear it. But they mention American support for Khmer Rouge early
Oh,
on
not yet,
as a
not yet. We're
destabilizing?
we're at the
We have not
beginning of the story.
we have not gotten there in the video. I wonder if they would, but it's funny. There were people in Cambodia we spoke to. Noah and I went to Cambodia and Vietnam for the purposes of this season, and we had people who were really helpful and showing us around, and even some people there didn't know about America's support for the Khmer Rouge. It's not that it's top secret. It was published by the journalists really on top of these stories at the time, but it seems like a much more important fact than it was ever really given given credit for. And that's part of the reason we were attracted to this season, was to not only cover the American bombing of Cambodia and Nixon and Kissinger and the story that is somewhat familiar to people, certainly the Vietnam War is, but to stay after the Vietnam War is over and then see where things went from there. Not only the rise of the Khmer Rouge, but then their weaponization by the United States against our old enemy Vietnam. And I think that people would be quite surprised to learn that, say, when the Vietnamese kicked out Pol Pot, we condemned them kicking out Pol Pot and enforced a sanctions regime against the new government in Phnom Penh during famine conditions. Things that might sound familiar to people from the topic we were just discussing moments ago. So it's a fascinating history, and one that I think, as we try to do, one that we think should be more well known.
All right. Well, let's continue with this this work of art.
CPK, who ruled Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. They were led by the infamous Pol Pot, who attempted to purify Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines. This led to one of the worst cases of genocide in history. Influenced by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, Pol Pot imagined his own super Great Leap Forward in Cambodia. After seizing power in a civil war in 1970,
You made a face there.
Well, I'm intrigued by the thought bubbles that Pol Pot is having. One was just a building, and which they did have.
Also, like, where
And
is he? He looks like he's in a room in a Counter-Strike map.
and then they wanted. It seems like he's dreaming of missiles. I guess I don't.
Yeah,
That
like
really
a super
actually
great
wasn't.
leap forward with missiles. They're leaping forward with missiles.
Yeah,
Just like Mao.
I'm learning. Just like Mao, I'm learning is what I'm saying.
1975, the CPK wanted to rapidly build the country under their own vision. Pol Pot compared the Cambodian revolution with those in China, Korea, and Vietnam, and proclaimed that no revolution would be as fast as his. Indeed, the CPK was obsessed with speed, and many in the party were paranoid that they would be replaced, and believed the faster their plans could be achieved, the safer they would be. The super Great Leap was to be achieved independent of any foreign aid, through independent self-mastery.
Guy sounds like
Khmer
Solid
Rouge
Snake.
theorists
What'd you say?
This guy sounds like Solid Snake to me.
Yeah, a little
Narrator.
bit. Well, I mean, put some respect on David Hayter's name, sir.
Well, I mean, we don't know that it's not him working on this documentary.
He would never do such a thing.
believe that
No,
an
I agree
initial
with you. I'm
period of
just hearing him. I'm
self-imposed
hearing this.
economic isolation would stimulate the rebirth of the crafts and the country's industrial capability. In order to follow this policy of extreme self-reliance, the CPK announced a 4-year plan to triple the country's rice production. However, Cambodia
hear
had
it, Noah?
suffered severely during the Civil War.
I'm
Almost
waiting. I'm
three-quarters
waiting
of
for him to. I'm waiting for the narrator to say the Khmer Rouge wanted a weapon to rival Metal Gear. Or
Yeah, no,
something like
it's
That was
it's
that.
pretty
really
good.
like quite intense. It's
you.
like, yeah, like I don't know, like brother number snake or something.
Otacon.
revolution. Yeah, revolutionary consciousness, huh?
Pol Pot lined up everyone with glasses and killed them. Otacon, you have glasses.
of the draft animals needed to plow the fields had been killed, and by 1975, rice production had dropped by 84%. Such a rapid increase in production was impossible, but Pol Pot believed this was merely a matter of revolutionary willpower and
One thing I
instituted
would
his
say is that
policy
like
of
it is worth pointing out, like Pol Pot was the head of this government, but like it was like a clique. Like it was kind of famously like there was a gang that was at the top of the Khmer Rouge during this period. Again, Pol Pot was the guy in charge, but Most famously, there was a foreign minister, Yang Sari, defense minister, Sun Sen, head of state, like the president, a guy named Q Sampan, and like they kind of collectively, this is also by, I mean, like in Nazi Germany, like Hitler was the concentrated power of authority, but like he also had like a gang at the top that made it possible for like the Nazi, that were like essentially the executive function in that regime. And I think it's, like here it was, again, like much poorer, much different place than 1930s Germany. But like what you do see is like this group that's like very paranoid, very secretive, that are carrying out this crazy radical, like, silly radical, like agricultural revolution. They're doing it, in this, crazy like this psychotically backbiting, incompetent way. And so that's like the only thing that I feel like is missing in describing this, is that like as one person we interviewed, the journalist Elizabeth Becker, who reported from Cambodia in these years, she said, not during the Khmer Rouge, but before and after, she said that like you have to remember that everything the Khmer Rouge did, just like imagine it's being done, but it's being done like really incompetently by like the most incompetent people in ways that you could not overrate or overstate.
Also, she was there during the Khmer Rouge years. She interviewed Pol Pot.
That's true. She did. She did visit. I just don't want to give the impression that she was like watching all this stuff happening and taking notes. But yes, she had a pretty famous and ill-omened visit.
Maybe
Okay,
Elizabeth is in this video.
What if the Nixon attitude towards Khmer Rouge early on was not about disrupting their Vietnamese neighbors' operations, but instead because Nixon was a secret Maoist?
Have you
guys talked about that?
This is what many of his right-wing critics thought. I mean, Nixon, it's interesting because Nixon came up as a part of the China lobby, kind of political club, which were the fanatics about getting rid of the Chinese revolution. But in partnering with Kissinger and making peace with communist China, as we discussed around the same time that we were actually signing on with Israel as a special relationship, Nixon was betraying, in a large sense, the Cold Warriors that he had come up with, and a lot of people thought he was, a communist somehow. So it has been floated, like John Birch Society types thought that.
Just saying, maybe that's something to investigate a little bit further. He is responsible for giving up the true China, which is
Taiwan.
Yeah, which is Taiwan. So, just saying.
Of agricultural offenses, including a nationwide system of forced labor. He believed that achieving his economic goals would be as simple as winning the Civil War. The army and the CPK's agricultural warfare were the people, and manual labor was the key to victory. The purpose of every Cambodian was to work and advance the revolution. Villages were reorganized into cooperatives, and thousands of city dwellers were forced out of their homes to work on the farms. As a result of this policy, workers of all ages were forced to do 10 to 14 hours of hard labor per day in unsustainable conditions. Often, survivors reported working late into the night, particularly during harvest time, surrounded by encouraging slogans urging them to pledge to sacrifice your life to accomplish Angar's work, or to stay on the work site until death. A lot of food was needed to feed all these productive farmers. However, rice was also needed for Pol Pot's economic goals, so large amounts of rice were extracted from the population for party use and export. The CPK provided nothing in return. Fareth, one survivor of the period, recalled that she was assigned to a children's work unit when she was 11 years old. Fareth was ordered to carry soil, dig trenches, and help build a local dam. She and her unit lived at the work site.
I'm getting the sense this video, like, there was just an interview there with a cartoon person. Like, that must be an interview based on reality, I assume, but they're not like sourcing anything. So I'm just worried this channel may not have the right approach towards sourcing, and it would undermine its academic viability.
Well, if you've already paid a guy on Fiverr, You might as well use them throughout the entire thing. It's an aesthetic choice that they're making, it seems.
It's true.
But, you know, one that is probably beneficial for their profit structure as well.
I didn't know David Hayter was on Fiverr, but they spent the money well.
So let me ask you this question. I guess it's like a broader snapshot of this video that we're watching. Do you feel like covering this perspective exclusively on how this was communism and it was bad communism, evil, scary, gives full attention to actually the rise and fall of the Khmer Rouge?
I think that like one of the things that sort of it really just depends on how much weight somebody tries to put on the communist dimension of this. Like, is this a really communist or Marxist vision? One source that we cite in the show actually talks about plans for agricultural reform that had been drawn up for Thailand, the country next door, that were not all that dissimilar. You know, there were real problems that Cambodia faced with a lot of people living in the city, living in Phnom Penh in particular. And, you know, there was some like rebalancing in order. Obviously, the way that the Khmer Rouge went about it was stupid and insane and violent. But I think that, you know, it's sort of like the Khmer Rouge didn't do all this because they had like a really, I think like really like a rich communist tradition they felt participating in. I think that their vision was actually much more nationalist in nature and was much more focused on a revitalization and renewal of the ancient, you know, Khmer kingdom. And that was the sort of axis through which like a lot of, you know, like a project of national renovation was really how they kind of characterized a lot of this. They didn't even publicly announce themselves as Marxist until a couple of years into the existence of the regime. And it was only after Mao died. And there was, you know, a lot of pressure from China, presumably, to make that happen.
It was China. There was a communist movement before the Khmer Rouge that was largely dismantled after the 50s, or in the middle of the 50s. They were the sort of second generation of Cambodian communists, and they harbored a lot of bitterness and resentment toward the Vietnamese, which had already existed in some kind of cultural and historical sense in Cambodia. But they really thought the Vietnamese were the final boss, and that everyone in the way, including the American imperialists, were going to do the easy part. And the fact that they did survive the Cambodian Civil War and the American bombing, in which the Viet Cong did the vast majority of the fighting, by the way, for them, only strengthened that idea. By the time they take power, they've been in a socialist movement, but it's been one informed by a kind of small, inward-looking movement that had much more to say about Cambodian nationalism, or believed far more deeply in Cambodian nationalism and therefore the xenophobia they had built up than they did on any kind of doctrine or socialist project. And they were criticized pretty ruthlessly by their Vietnamese and Chinese friends. Eventually, the Vietnamese weren't their friends, and even when the Chinese were their patron, the Chinese stopped trying to argue with them about the extremism of their program because they were useful enough to them. The Khmer Rouge were useful enough to Beijing as a geopolitical ally, but they really didn't think much of the Khmer Rouge program. So the communist world and the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, had nothing to do with the Khmer Rouge, and in fact tried to unseat them while the U.S. was making common cause with them. So as a communist movement, it was really quite a black sheep in the 20th century. And whether you even care about, you know, these labels of what kind of communists they were and blah, 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 I mean, there's a lot of writing on that. Some suggest it was more of a classic peasant revolution that had far less to do with modern ideas of socialism and communism. But they certainly at first identified as such. When they go into the jungles in the 80s, after the Vietnamese kicked them out and the Americans start supporting them, though, they were the first communist party to dissolve themselves. And Pol Pot said, we're going to have to follow the West now. And they got rid of their Mao jackets and they started wearing safari suits. And so they gave up the communist look pretty quickly, which of course makes some suspect that they ever
And
really.
they also, I don't think, were ever like, they didn't have like, they didn't have like a rich set of relations with other third world nations. They were very isolated. They were, like a lot of communist states uh have meaningful foreign relations, and in the case of the Khmer Rouge, they had one set of relations with China, which sent them a bunch of money, and that was who they cared about. And that for a time at the beginning they had relations with Vietnam before that went south. And yeah, I mean, to me, like,
Seems like
to
you're
sort of
saying
just
they're MAGA
reiterate,
communists.
yeah,
That's what
I
someone
mean,
said in the majority report comment section the other day, which in a way, where they were they were make Cambodia great again, communists.
Yeah,
But
MACA.
yes, in a sense they were.
Yeah, or
Maka, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
Makaga.
I could use some Mac.
MACAGA.
But
Love
yeah,
Mac's.
they gave up their communism pretty quickly as soon as it became advantageous to. So I guess that if people want to judge them on how they acted once they were out of power, it doesn't seem too sincere. They let the Yugoslavs in to film a documentary at one point, but otherwise Noah's right. Their only real relationship in the trading and economic sense was with China, and the U.S. We funneled them money and arms and training through a coalition, which is always useful to do, kind of like the Mujahideen, and just claimed that if anything gets to the Khmer Rouge, we had no idea. Of course, most of it did. Peter Jennings did a great documentary piece for ABC in the early 90s, and we were still supporting them, and basically told the world that we were. It's really good. I think it's still on YouTube. I grabbed a copy elsewhere, but for the show, but it's a good report, and unfortunately, it didn't stop us doing it.
One thing that you brought up was the way that the media was talking about the Khmer Rouge early on during the
Mhm.
period of our, not so overt allegiance. And I think that is very instructive, usually, in figuring out like where the State Department's opinions lie. I believe you said that there was like positive coverage as well, not dissimilar to Osama bin Laden from Western media.
In the beginning, the most positive coverage of the Khmer Rouge were coming from left-wing sympathizers who thought that there was no way that these stories from refugees going into Thailand could possibly be true. There was a history, a very
the
real
Noam
history they were
Chomsky,
pointing.
the Noam Chomsky paradigm as well. Isn't that like something that
He got in trouble for saying that we have to be suspect about the stories. I think it's been a little exaggerated to the degree that it's not as though he said they're all lies, but he was operating off of the, again, very real history that we also cover in the show of pure invention of communist atrocity when it came to Vietnam. So I think there were a lot of left wingers who were like, I'm not going to get fooled again, and in so
And like, I
doing
mean,
did not see it.
the Vietnamese themselves, like, bottled, like, they were, like, about 2 years into the reign of the Khmer Rouge, when things, I mean, really after the first year, when things started to go quite badly, the sort of, like, one way that they began resolving their problems without really resolving them was by attacking Vietnam, which China was happy for, because they wanted Vietnam, they viewed Vietnam as their principal rival, and they were like, well, Cambodia is kind of a basket case, but if they're gonna, take the fight to Vietnam, then fuck it, good for them. And I think that, like, in Vietnam, we cite sources, people who ended up after a border conflict, where Cambodian forces, Khmer Rouge forces, massacre Vietnamese villages. And these are people from Soviet bloc countries, not necessarily that sympathetic to Cambodia in the stage, more sympathetic to Vietnam, and they are just learning. After like 2 years into this, they're like, oh, only now am I like did I start to consider that like the Cambodian Holocaust stories were real. That's what this journalist, this Hungarian journalist called them. But I think that that's sort of a good illustration of also how like the earliest coverage of these people really emphasized like the mystery and secretiveness of this, because again, like, that's part of what happens when you don't have foreign relations, is that like the only people who end up supporting your doofy radical program are academics who don't know better, and don't have firsthand knowledge, and I guess China in this case.
Uh, the more striking stuff is the coverage of them, the positive coverage of them long after these were reported. And we cite one New York Times op-ed that whose title was Pol Pot, brutal, yes, but no mass murderer. And the pull quote in that is Vietnam is the real threat to Cambodia. This was because, and actually that journalist was a very involved journalist in covering the brutal wars America was waging in Indochina. And he had just preserved a certain, I suppose you would say, misguided allegiance to the Khmer Rouge to the point where he opposed the Vietnamese into the 90s for, I guess, being mean to them and overthrowing Pol Pot. At any rate, it was in the New York Times. It was good enough for them. And of course, there were sort of feigned protests by American diplomats, but we preserved their seat at the UN and allowed for good coverage of them and positive coverage of them. So that's perhaps more shocking to people. And of course, the actual U.S. policy itself is shocking. But they when Elizabeth Becker, one of the key guests in our show, she was with one of these Western academics. He's all Scottish, I think, or Australian.
Yeah, he was a Scottish academic who worked at SOAS in London. Malcolm McDowell.
And he got murdered a room over from her while they were visiting, and they were interviewing Pol Pot, and she almost got attacked herself, but she escaped. And he was killed. She suspects that the Cambodians did it to kind of say never come back, even though they were the ones who had invited her and the deceased guy. So yeah, it was an odd ideological trajectory from all sides as the sort of the super third worldists and the American architects of foreign policy came together in saying these guys aren't so bad because the Vietnamese are the real imperialists at this point.
And
very,
that
very
was
bizarre.
like the narrative of like Vietnam as like committing like wanton massacres. I mean, there were the issues over like boat people, Chinese ethnic minorities in Vietnam and their treatment. Like Vietnam was catching a lot of black eyes in the sort of global PR of the time, but like they were absorbing all that while they were like, and people were criticizing them for being the military power and control of Cambodia throughout the 1980s. But they always sort of leave out that like, well, the reason Vietnam was still there was because the Khmer Rouge were running that insurgency. So there is this also like this process where it's like they valorize the Khmer, or sorry, not valorize, but like they there was this toleration of the Khmer Rouge, and like instead of talking about their crimes or even talking about the Vietnamese tribunal of Khmer for Khmer Rouge crimes, like not even wanting to engage with the Vietnamese presence at all, we immediately thought like, well, how can we use Pol Pot against them because they must be so de facto, like they are Hitler, not us, not Pol Pot. It's the Vietnamese.
And the Vietnamese had their citizens massacred by the thousands right on their border. This wasn't us going to Iraq and starting a 10-year occupation for no reason, or even the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which we covered last year, which again was right on their border. The Khmer Rouge were hoping to start a war with Vietnam, and they did. And Vietnam simply said, all right, we're nipping this in the bud. We know all the fucked up stuff these people have done, and it's not coming to us. And that is why they took the action that they did. They probably weren't so interested in an invasion, given they had to reconstruct their country, which wasn't an easy thing to do. We cover that as kind of like a side story in the show, because the U.S. promised Vietnam war reparations under Nixon. And once he was ousted, we said, Nixon who? And denied them their reparations.
I mean, it looks
so
like
Vietnam had a lot of.
Oh no, I was just saying because Hasan was like scrolling this video, and it looks like this video is just kind of about like how much life sucked under the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah.
Like there's a
Fair
section on children and child labor, then there's one on executions and one on prison. I mean, it makes sense. Like it's interesting in that like the Khmer Rouge did have an interrogation and executions policy. Like I don't know to what extent this video gets super deep into that, but like all of their torture centers, like it was the whole program was called S21, and the idea about it. Oh yeah, this is like the expression. And by the way, this guy Richard Dudman, he was a reporter at the St. Louis Dispatch for many years in the 20th century. He was an American reporter who had witnessed firsthand. He had been one of the very few reporters who, in the early 1970s, was in Cambodia and was with Vietnamese troops, Viet Cong soldiers, as they hid from American bombs being dropped on Cambodia. So, like, to give you a sense of how powerful the anti-Vietnam dogma was, a guy who saw the Americans bomb Cambodia firsthand and whose life was in danger because of it is the guy who wrote this Pol Pot article, because that's how strong, that's how much we can make them into bad guys.
You know, this is another thread of this season is the Sino-Soviet split, which is really representative of the greater split among, you know, the left all across the world, including the most annoying contingent of the left, the Western left. And the Western left had a bunch of crack-ups about, you know, like, are you a Maoist? Are you a third worldist? Are you supporting Pol Pot and the Maoist movements, the real movements? Or are you a fucking revisionist social fascist who supports the USSR? And, you know, the USSR wrote off a lot of the Chinese allies and the Chinese themselves as wackos. It's a very interesting conflict. But yeah, Dudman, I don't know if he was like ideologically on that level, but sort of as a reporter, yeah, he, as I said earlier, he was one of these guys who allowed his sympathy in the 60s for the Khmer Rouge fighters to turn him against the other fighters against the American war, the Vietnamese. And so it was like this strange, like, sort of siphoning off of support until people would arrive at only the Khmer Rouge, people of a certain opinion, which is a strange place to end up. But you can kind of see how it happens. I don't know. Strange times.
Damn. So would you say that this period of American foreign policy is like uniquely schizophrenic, or like is it the madman
actually, in a
theory,
lot
or
of ways, it makes a lot of sense. Like, that's part of what's so jarring and horrible about it, is that like essentially part of what the Cambodia, there's a book that we cite a lot in our show for this season called Sideshow, by the journalist William Shawcross. And although he later on like moved
Who
to the
also
right,
had an ideological journey.
Yeah, he's you can look him up. He's a British journalist. He's right wing now. But this original book, Sideshow, like, it was called Sideshow because the idea was that the Cambodia was a sideshow to the Vietnam War. But I think what our season has sort of recovered is not so much that, like, yes, the Vietnam conflict, yes, we bombed Cambodia, and that was because we tried to widen the Vietnam War in an effort to end it. We were like, all right, well, Nixon said, you know, I'd rather not just withdraw from Vietnam. I'd like to withdraw from Vietnam, but I want to increase the pressure, and I want to bomb where I think the Vietnamese are in Cambodia. And eventually that's, you know, like that was pushing the sets of dominoes that lead to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, sparking the civil war in that country and all that. But the other thing that Cambodia is not just the sideshow to the Vietnam War, but it was this part of this, you know, larger drama by which the U.S. was like rearranging what its Cold War strategy was for what became the final phase of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The Khmer Rouge and the support for the Khmer Rouge was an early joint venture with China. You could look at it that way. Yep. You could see the sort of, you know, the cynicism in our policy as having actually like a really kind of dramatic coherence to it. I think what's schizophrenic is just how what feels schizophrenic and so immoral is that there was no reason that Henry Kissinger had to bomb Cambodia and also make detente with the Soviet Union. Why couldn't we just have detente? What was the fucking purpose of setting this country on fire, ultimately to arrive at the same thing in 1975 that would have fucking happened anyway years earlier with the end of Saigon, the fall of Saigon?
To ventriloquize the Kissinger-Nixon logic a little bit, I think they viewed the world in the grand chessboard, spheres of influence, 19th century Bismarckian way. And that's certainly how Kissinger wrote and thought. And that's how Nixon, maybe not at the beginning of his career, but by the time he was the president, that's how he thought. He was considered himself a foreign policy president and one in the mold of creating a stable world order in which America is first among equals. When you take that view, prestige matters a lot. And so I think that, not to actually disagree with Noah about the human cost of any of this, but to their minds, if they were going to embark on as risky and bold a venture as making peace with China and normalizing relations with China to basically drive a wedge in the communist world, or take advantage of a wedge that was already forming in the communist world, they couldn't also lose the Vietnam War and also the war in Cambodia. They had to be strong enough by winning or perpetuating that war and punishing our victims there, to be strong enough and have this credibility of strength to make this other bold move, and vice versa. So it became a feedback loop of this kind of horrible logic where big countries we can work with, like China or the Soviet Union, because they got the SALT treaty out of it with the Soviet Union, which was good. But it's always at the expense of the smaller nations. This was something that Fidel kind of said around the time of the missile crisis, which you can agree with and disagree with as well in certain ways, which was like, although overall I find it persuasive, which is the United States and the USSR, we know they're going to work stuff out. The question is, what happens to us, the small countries? And I think that was the same question hanging over Nixon and Kissinger's peace deals with China for Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It was a trade-off to them. You couldn't have one without the other. I think that's
in
what makes
Kissinger's case, the irony, not irony, the horrible thing is that in a way he was kind of the dude who was born for this mission, because his actual academic research and what he spent, or not research, it's a strong word for it, but what he spent time writing about and sort of espousing opinions about in Foreign Affairs magazine and stuff, was about this idea of fighting little wars in what he called the gray areas of the world. Yeah, I think he was a strategy master of this exact thing, and he was ready made for what Nixon needed, which was in essence to set the third world on fire. Because by the way, it wasn't just Cambodia. I mean, there's a very good book by the historian Paul Thomas Chamberlain called "The Cold War Killing Fields" that sort of tells the story of how the Cold War was this insanely hot war in all these little countries. I mean, or you had
even some not so little ones like Indonesia.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Indonesia or fucking Bangladesh and Pakistan. I mean, those are not small countries either. I mean, it's rather, I mean, it's rather, there are some rather savage wars of peace. You could argue.
Yeah, and it's not to defend or revise the idea in America, and certainly in the countries where this happened, that Kissinger and Nixon were involved in evil ventures or brutal, senseless violence. But I think it's worth clinically and carefully looking at why their policy was what it was, and what stabilizing things did come out of it, and what destabilizing things and terrible things came out of it. It was good to make peace with communist China. That was a needlessly hostile and destructive American policy for decades. It wasn't a good thing to obviously base that kind of progress on the expense of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in Indochina. Anthony Blinken possesses all of the craven aspects, for example, of what Kissinger would allow or enforce for his president on the global stage, with obviously zero of the vision or pretenses to vision that you can at least recognize in a self-aggrandizing but ultimately significant historical statesman like Kissinger. Blinken is just a hopeless fool, and the American foreign policy now doesn't have anything like the kind of gutsy vision that these imperial minds had in the middle of the Cold War. So that's a way of talking about schizophrenia, the different angles. Like the last thing I'll say about it to sum it up is, in China, when Kissinger died, he is officially a celebrated figure.
Yeah.
Americans, there's memes and he was evil. He's the most evil guy, which I sometimes think is kind of lets every other American war criminal off the hook. If it's just like, oh, there's just one guy who
Yeah.
was just the one evil person. It's not to defend or be an apologist. I think it's a little bit of baby's first,
Well, he is the
um,
reason that the Kissinger hate is so passionate is because of a very specific thing, which is that he lied about the Vietnam War ending. And like the sense of antipathy that I think like generations of Americans have held for him for years in particular really just comes down to like that more than anything, that he was like Nixon's Vietnam butt boy, and like that the justifiable and totally correct hatred of him at front.
he got a Nobel Peace Prize.
Exactly. Like
That
it makes a lot, it's he was sort
so
of,
did Obama.
I mean, I was gonna say he reminds me honestly of like Elon Musk. Like just imagine having to see his fucking mug everywhere for the 70s. Like my God, that would be annoying.
Yeah.
Although it must be said, Kissinger was he had far more game than Elon Musk. He had far more riz than Elon
Yeah.
Musk,
Yeah,
which
I
is
mean,
not
he
a
did
high
a lot.
bar.
He did a lot with how ugly he was. So I want to ask you guys one final question, but like, in terms of like, I guess on its face, somewhat incomprehensible foreign policy movements that the Nixon Kissinger duo engaged in, do you see an analog there with the current administration and the way that they're dealing with the dynamics between Hezbollah, Iran, the Gulf states, and also Israel? Or is it more so just like you said on autopilot at this point, and it's just like Anthony Blinken is a wormish figure who is just trying to let everybody dominate him. He's just sitting in the cuck seat along for the journey.
I agree with that. The one thing I would add is say that like, maybe the way to look at it is not like, oh, is this situation like that one or something, but it's like, what are the dynamics that were present in that situation and that may be present in this one and vice versa? Like in this case, like in Lebanon and Cambodia are not like an exact parallel. They're not like, and you can't force them. But there is a truth to the fact that like Cambodia and Lebanon were both sort of drawn into this, they're sort of in a conflict with Israel that is connected to a conflict that is connected to this other frontier of the conflict. And now Israel, as the war making party in the way that the US was, now has to like spread the war around because it cannot resolve the domestic political issues that would come with actually just ending the war, which in Nixon's case was the paranoia about not losing the war, really, his obsession with that, in addition to the anti-communist fervor or whatever. And in the case of Israel, it's about like, I mean, it's all of the things that we talked about earlier, the ideology, the sense, the actual stakes of survival or financial crisis and so on. But to me, that's sort of the point of comparison, is about like the degree to which like, a war can spread and suck other things in for no good, intelligible reason at all, other than to satisfy, the political prerogatives of the war-making party.
Yeah, we've talked about how there was a vision on behalf that the Nixon and Kissinger were pursuing. China, détente with the USSR, that was far more, honestly, compared to the policy that came before, far more coherent and possibly constructive even. That was taken in tandem with incredibly senseless wars that they viewed as bargaining chips, the countries involved as bargaining chips. I think what you have is no vision in the American side nowadays that could compare to their idea of a new world order that they were building. Israel's an alliance with Israel being one part of that, and it's Israel who is taking just the senseless violence half of the Nixon-Kissinger strategy, which, as Noah just said, you compare Nixon's remark when he announced the invasion of Cambodia. He said, to your point, Hasan, at the top of our part of the show, he said, "This is not an invasion. This is a way to end the war in Vietnam." In other words, escalating things into Cambodia is a way to de-escalate them in Vietnam. Well, what did Israel say the other day? We are escalating things as a way to achieve de-escalation. It's hard not to see an echo of what we discussed this season and the kind of ripple effects that can have on a formerly nearby but neutral third country. And it remains to be seen. I hate when people say this, but we have to see, how Hezbollah, which has been attacked and has the right to self-defense, how conservative they are and how much of a balancing act they are willing to put up. Because Cambodia put up a balancing act for many years to spare itself the violence. And eventually it failed. So we'll have to see how that goes in this case. But no one in our current day is, unfortunately, can be said to be as on the level of Nixon and Kissinger, I think, as far as their grand master plans are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, we're now in a position where like Nixon and Kissinger, part of what made them so special, let's say, or unique, was that Kissinger literally had permission as soon as he became a national security advisor to like redo the wiring in Washington and become the most powerful advisor, like the hand of the prince or the hand of the king or whatever.
Literally the wiring.
He could do whatever, he had the authority to do all that. And one of the things with Biden world that's sort of become evident is that there's this troika at the top. You have Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, and Bill Burns, who's the head of the CIA. And Bill Burns is the one who clearly is trusted with like the big boy stuff or whatever, but like there isn't actually any, I don't really believe at this stage that we have any evidence that there is a driver's seat, let alone somebody in it, in terms of like the American strategic outlook here. So to affirm what Brennan was saying, that like there's nobody who's on the Nixon Kissinger level or whatever, because like the situation that we have now is not is not anything like that. It's this inertia. It's this horrible, it's like a carotid artery that's like, exactly what like, pro-Israel lobby has purchased and won for itself through its machinations. Like that's what it wants, because that is what enables the status quo to persist. It was a different era 50 years ago, just a radically different time.
It's just hard to comprehend when you have to consider that there is like this incredibly powerful force, this blight on human society for so many generations is just like basically falling asleep at the wheel, and like the car is just 3 seconds removed from flying off the side of the cliff. Like it feels insane.
I think autopilot is the right word. I mean, it's not to say like America doesn't know what it's doing or no one's at the wheel, but I think autopilot in terms of the strategic, again, not to overuse the word, but the strategy, the strategic vision, the idea of how America's power is going to sustain itself over the next 100 years. Nixon and Kissinger, they thought they had a plan for that, and wasn't quite 100 years, but they did set down a lot of things in stone that stuck. By now, I think their China policy has been reversed. Obviously, we're in a Cold War with China in many ways. The Israel alliance is still there.
I mean, they left room for that too. It's not like, strategic ambiguity is obviously like still leaving a lot of
the Soviet Union fell, So in a sense, maybe the China factor was not as important to them. Although in Nixon's waning years, he did say that NATO needs to back off, because what would come after the Soviet Union, should we continue to creep up to them, would be and as he considered it, an even more dangerous form of Russian nationalism. And he said NATO needs to chill out, as did a lot of other Cold Warriors. Kissinger, in his final years, was talking about how America should do business with Belt and Road, not attack it. So very different form of statecraft than, it's not to endorse it, but it has very key differences from the sort of, again, lazy and incoherent liberal aggression that you find under, or I should say aggression that you find under a liberal government like Biden, with the so-called, liberal brain trust like Sullivan and Mr. Blues man, what's his name? Anthony Blinken.
Oh, Blinken.
Like that's.
No, I mean that does make sense though, with what you said about Nixon and what you said about Kissinger tracks with like their realpolitik attitude in terms of like understanding the changes that are happening broadly around the globe and like responding to them in a very cold and calculated manner that is beneficial for America. Whereas nowadays I feel like in the post 9/11 universe, we have a significantly more like liberal savior attitude. Like we have seemingly deluded ourselves into thinking that like, no, we are the world police and that is a good thing. And it's not necessarily something that you just tell the American population so that you can justify whatever imperialist endeavor you engage in.
Well, and just one last thing on that. It's like you hear it all the time, but I heard it yet again the other day where Biden said, "America will not retreat from the world," and that's the type of that's the line they've gone with. And it's like, all right, well, then don't retreat from withholding Israel's aid and weapons and money. You're retreating from the world in a very significant sense when you don't use the leverage you have over a client state committing an extermination campaign and just let them do it. That sounds like a retreat to me, but that's of course not what the actual line is meant to convey. What they mean is that it makes it sound like it's a bold and active approach towards solving problems, when in fact it's trying to say we won't retreat from the world, meaning we won't retreat from a failed imperial autopilot that has really no ideas left. We're just going to stick with it because if you really wanted to not retreat, you might be more active in solving this conflict. I hate the word conflict in regards to Palestine, but certainly the ability to yank Israel's ability to wage war away from it, that would be pretty proactive, but no one seems to want to do it.
And beneficial for future American moral posturing.
It would be. It unambiguously would be.
And electorally beneficial. Like, so.
If they came out and said people would see through it. Probably people on this call and watching it would see through it. But they could come out and say, we did it. We got the ceasefire. We yanked their weapons away. And guess what? American power, baby. We got.
And by the way, guess who's gone? That bad man Netanyahu. Oh, what? He was popular in Israel at the time that we decapitated him. Don't fucking care. We're America. No, they're not. Like, it's
we're humiliated.
I mean, this is where like one of the ways out.
Liberal Zionism was always the exit ramp that I thought they would take far before this moment. And when Benny Gantz came to America to talk to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, I was like, oh, this is what they're going to do. They're going to get the fucking liberal general to be like the new leader. And now that method has been a demonstrable failure because you got fucking Benny Gantz like outside of the governing coalition now. And Benjamin Netanyahu's popularity has only increased. And you even have the likes of Yair Lapid, the supposed centrist opposition to Benjamin Netanyahu, like chirping like a seal in celebration of blowing up Lebanese pagers and the prospect of invading Lebanon. It's insane.
Yep. Yeah. I think it's hit it on the head earlier that it's certainly key that Israel's internal politics do not allow for anyone that America wants to work with to come to any kind of reasonable conclusion at this point. It's turtles all the way down there with the maniac mentality. But that would simply mean that those in the White House and the State Department and elsewhere could, as we said just a moment ago, say we're America, baby, and we're not going to let anyone tell us what to do, whether they're an ally or not. And we're gonna force them and bring them to a heel. But that's actually far too bold and far too gutsy for them to try. So they're just going to, let it all happen, which is politically makes them look weak and more importantly allows a horrible slaughter to continue, obviously.
Yeah, it's all good. American soldiers will go and die in battle in Lebanon if Israel chooses to do so. And then that will be so politically disadvantageous to the Democratic Party's position of failing to stop this dead in its tracks that Donald Trump will become president. And then Donald Trump will be seen as the bold, brave savior of American foreign policy by quickly putting together at least like a fake deal that makes Netanyahu seem like he's actually backed away. And then he'll allow Benjamin Netanyahu to annex the West Bank.
Yep.
Great stuff overall.
Possible.
Awesome. Great job, Joe.
Anyway, thanks so much,
You did it,
guys, for
Joe.
coming on. Where can people find your podcast?
They can find our
Blowback
podcast at blowback.show.
Blowback.show. Press the big button that says subscribe. Our season, you'll get it all at once, not just the 10 main episodes where we talk you through this story, but also bonus episodes. We do interviews with Cy Hirsch. We do interviews with some of the journalists we mentioned on this call, Elizabeth Becker. As we said, we went to Cambodia and Vietnam this season. So we sprinkle in a lot of moments where we're talking to people who live there, who lived through this stuff. And we have obviously those interviews are translated. And we're pretty proud of it, and we hope everyone goes and signs up and enjoys it.
Oh, before you guys leave, I have an extra question. Noah, specifically for you, you hang out with Cy. Have you ever asked him about a particular Benjamin Nitai that he may or may not have gotten classified intel from when writing an article for the New York Times back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, he told me that story. It's a great story about how basically, and this is in his Substack, which I encourage people to subscribe to, but he talks about how it was common knowledge that when Benjamin Netanyahu was deputy ambassador at the UN, deputy ambassador in DC and then ambassador at the UN, he was a go-to guy to get intel. And
not
understood
necessarily
it.
Israeli intel, right? American
Correct.
intel.
It was Israeli intel or American, but the idea was that Netanyahu would share intel and would schmooze with the press very openly and aggressively. No, Cy he's got he's got many stories like that over many, many years. And I was lucky enough to hear that one right before he published it. So hopefully, some of the other goofy ones he's told me will be coming out in his Substack sometime soon. But yeah, we talked to him this season as well, and he was it's the only episode that we've ever done that is just totally unedited. Like, it is just the phone call with me, Brendan, and Cy, and it's really, really fun. It's really good.
Hell yeah. That's Blowback Podcast. Everybody, thank you so much. Brendan James, Noah Cullivan, for coming on. Love to have you guys, as always.
Hasan.
Thank you, Hasan. Take it easy.
Bye.